Hello, everyone. Good morning to those of us in the United States, afternoon in UK and parts of Europe, good evening, good night to folks joining us from Asia and the Middle East. Thank you guys so much for being here. This webinar is going to be about taboo talk in the workplace. I'll introduce myself. I'm Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza. I'm an independent journalist based on the East Coast of the United States. I cover work, the labor market, and women in the workplace. I've written for outlets including the BBC, the Washington Post, The Economist, Quartz, Fast Company, and Digiday's Work Life. This webinar is brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. Attuned shows companies what really matters to their employees by making visible the psychological data that exists around and between people. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker and communicate more effectively, which in turn reduces employee turnover, drives engagement, productivity, and innovation. It increases psychological safety and ultimately builds happier, more successful organizations. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing taboo talk in the workplace. Things once absolutely off limits at work, like race, gender, sexual orientation, and mental health, are now a regular part of training curriculum. Sometimes they're the uniting factor in employee resource groups or affinity groups, and they're the topic of discussion in public forums and at industry conferences. It's far more acceptable now to share an emotional intimacy with our colleagues, but how does this change our interpersonal relationships at work? And what are the implications of things like gossip, oversharing, shame, and even conspiratorial beliefs? Today, I'm joined by Shimul Melwani. She's an associate professor of organizational behavior, a Sarah Graham Keenan scholar, and the associate dean of the undergraduate business program at Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Dr. Yingli Deng, associate professor of organizational behavior at Durham University Business School in the UK. Welcome to both of you. I'll let our audience know that we'll reserve some time at the end for Q&A with both of our panelists. So please put any questions or comments you have in the chat or via the Q&A section, and we'll also answer them throughout the conversation, so feel free to ask at any time. To kick things off, we'll start with a poll. I'd like for our audience to answer, what topics are taboo for you? What would you not feel comfortable discussing in the workplace? We have a couple options like politics, race, sexual orientation. If you check something else in this poll, let us know what that is in the comments. I'm really curious to see what folks are uncomfortable talking about. You can, of course, submit that anonymously if you'd like through the Q&A chat. We won't reveal who you are. So let's begin by having our panelists tell us a little bit more about their research. So Shimul, tell us about the work that you do at UNC, plus tell us one thing that you would feel uncomfortable talking about at work.
Thank you, and thanks for that great introduction. I'm really excited to be here talking about something that I think is particularly interesting because it's taboo, right? It's like we're voyeuristically sort of curious about things that are hidden, but at the same time, it's difficult to sort of bring our authentic selves without talking about it. So I think that in a nutshell covers a lot of what I do my research on. Largely, I've sort of spent most of my career working on really questions of emotions when we weren't talking about emotions at work. And now that we are talking about emotions at work, I have moved my research to talking about things or studying things that remain a little bit under the surface. So I've studied sort of interpersonal behaviors like gossip and flirting. I'm also really sort of thinking about different forms of invisible and visible identities and how we bring that to work and what we decide to share about them. I guess the last part of your question was, what is something that is taboo? It was really hard for me to think about just one thing, so I'll talk about three, and they weren't on the list there, which was, I think politics is one, particularly in the United States, but I guess, I grew up in India, so politics in a lot of countries. The second one is religion. It's something we don't often talk about or think about at work. And then the last one, which some of my colleagues around the country are doing research on, is women's health issues, particularly things that relate to like menopause and menstruation and things that affect all women or many women at work. And we don't actually talk about these issues.
Well, welcome. Yingli, what kind of research do you do at Durham, and what's something that you would feel uncomfortable discussing at work?
Thank you. It's very excited to hear what Shimo has already shared because we have so many things in common. So I study emotions as well, and particularly I study these negative moral emotions like shame and envy and how people react to it in the workplace. And another stream of my research focuses on ethical behaviors in the workplace and especially how the unethical behavior is contagious within a group. So I'm also interested in the team dynamics. And the things that I personally find very hard or not very comfortable talk with my colleagues are definitely politics and also more about the my private life. For example, if someone talk about their marriage status, their dating status, that is um, a little bit hard for me at least. And so this is the things, and also salary or the promotion. So I found those things are also a little bit hard to discuss sometimes.
And all things that I can think of being more discussed in the workplace. I've even written articles about how to talk to other people about your salary as a means of maybe finding gaps, biased pay gaps by gender or by race. And nobody wants to do it, even though sometimes salary transparency, for instance, in the US is required in some places. Many people still feel uncomfortable talking about it. So, Yingli, thanks for sharing that. I'm so looking forward to this. So let's get started. As I mentioned, there are some things that are used to be totally off limits, but now are a regular part of discourse at work. Like I mentioned, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, mental health. From your point of view, and we'll start with you, Shmuel, what are the advantages and disadvantages of speaking so candidly around our colleagues?
So this is it's a great question because it does highlight sort of the double-sided coin of authenticity or openness at work. I think the thing I'd sort of share, I'll speak on two main issues. So there's in emotions research, there's a concept or construct called emotional labor, where very often it's really like putting on it basically equates to putting on a face where you show specific emotions but hide others. It's been studied a lot, for example, with retail workers, where you're or customer service agents, where you're expected to show a certain set of emotions. And the research on this really shows that pretending or showing emotions that are more superficial is very exhausting. And so it takes a toll on us over time. And, so we could think a little bit about, in some ways, like hiding very key aspects of our identity as being a version of emotional labor. There's some not yet like published work that calls it sort of a form of what we call identity labor, where you're coming in, you're almost pretending to be someone who's a little bit different. You have a mask on, and over time, that can be a very depleting experience. It can make you feel like you want to withdraw from a situation because you're not able to really fully bring yourself. And I think from an organizational standpoint, you'll end up losing out on some of the benefits of these differential identities that people bring to the workplace, so that the benefits that we want to see from diversity, which is people bringing different ideas and creating products that accordingly meet the standards of many different people, doesn't actually happen. So that's in some ways the disadvantage of not being able to share. If you don't share, like, these are some of the things that could happen. And the advantage, of course, is then you have the benefit of people getting to know you, you form better relationships, and all those positives that can happen. And in particular, I would say the positive of sharing is you're able to build relationships with people that normally you might not have, because we come with many different identities, and only when we start talking about some of them do we actually form more positive and better relationships, because now people can understand your perspective instead of immediately assuming negative intent.
Yingli, what do you think are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the way we're talking now in the workplace far more openly than in the past?
Yeah, definitely there's lots of advantages. For example, employees who feel comfortable discussing these topics, they are more likely to feel valued and included in the workplace, right? So that is definitely very beneficial. And also studies have shown that encouraging conversations about these sensitive topics can actually have positive impact on the workplace culture by promoting this understanding, empathy, and respect among employees, and which can in turn actually increase the, let's say, collaboration, innovation, and job satisfaction. And like Shimo mentioned already, it also helps build the relationships, connections. So when you actually share about this, when you receive the support, right, that can actually help you get access to the resources and share this experience and get resources very beneficial. But at the same time, the disadvantages, I would talk about another concept related to emotion again, since Shimo and I are the emotion researchers here. So this also related to the emotion text associated with this conversation. So the emotional text refer to the psychological and emotional burden that individuals have, especially from the underrepresented groups. And when we discuss these sensitive topics such as the race, sexual orientation, gender identity, when engaging about these topics, people may feel a range of negative emotions, including, let's say, anxiety, stress, fear, and discomfort. And these are not comfortable and can definitely have negative effect for the employees and for the organizations.
Yingli, something that you've studied, as you mentioned before, is feelings of shame, which I think can be very interesting. I understand that they can be caused by all sorts of things, but that it's a very complicated emotion and it really affects our behavior. So I would imagine that employees aren't exactly willing to admit when they're feeling shame.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that manifest in the workplace? And how does it change the way we interact with and relate to others that we work with?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. Admitting to feeling this shame can absolutely be very tough, especially in the workplace, as we all want to show our or put our best foot forward, right? So we don't want to show our negative image in front of others, especially if it's our coworkers. And so, of course, admitting to the shame is very hard. And even though people may not want to admit they feel the feelings of shame, but actually the shame can sneak into our interactions and relations. So generally, when people deal with shame, they take two actions. So they either avoidance or withdrawal. So instead of admitting feeling the shame or embarrassed about something, we might just avoid the topic altogether. And so if we feel insecure about a topic and insecure about our knowledge, we for this sensitive topics like race or mental health, we might just stay away from the conversation. And then another way that people react to their feelings of shame is overcompensation. So on the flip side, some of us may actually go into override and trying to prove ourselves to others. So if we feeling ashamed of our lack of knowledge or sensitivity around certain topics, we might try to overcompensate or compensate by being actual vocal, but that can sometimes come off as defensive and insincere, which doesn't help build authentic connections. And in the study that in our study, so we really diving into the lives of working parents and the unique challenges they face. And working parents are in a tough spot because they are trying to live up to the perfect worker image at their jobs, while also being super parents at home. I believe some of our audience are working parents as well. So we all know that this balancing act isn't easy. And in this study, we focus on a thing called parental identity threat. So it's basically when something happens at work that makes parents question their effectiveness or dedication as parents. Let's say, imagine you go to work and your coworker just ask you, you work such long hours, maybe you not have enough quality time with your kids, right? So, or you may not have enough time to make some meals for your kids, make you doubt your parenting, making you realize that, I'm not a good parent. And so in our article, we suggested that in this case, you will feel shame. Shame is a really tough emotion that comes from thinking you failed in some moral or personal way, kind of like feeling you are not a good person because of your choice. And in this context, you may feel you are not a good parent because your coworkers start question your core concept as a parent. And so for working parents, this might mean stepping back from work tasks. As I mentioned, right, one way that people deal with their feelings of shame is to withdraw. And so in this case, the working parents, they may just back away from their task and as a way to deal with their feelings. And they do this to show they're still committed to being a great parent. And also, they're also trying to avoid any judgment about putting their job before their kids. However, on the other side, these working parents, they are more likely to spend more quality time with their children. And so they wanted to show that they can actually turn it around. After feeling like they didn't do something right, they might start doing something to show they really care about being good at something important to them, like being a parent. So this is the main findings about our study. And I found it's a very good example to showing that when people will feel shame at workplace and how this shame will not only affect people's behaviors in the workplace, but also at home.
I noticed that when Yingli mentioned overcompensation, Shmuel, you kind of laughed there a minute. What were you thinking when she said overcompensation?
No, I mean, I think, I've been very fascinated by the emotion of shame. And I know that one of the things that also tends to happen, and, I smiled at it because I think there's a very natural tendency for many people to do that. There's also this sort of secondary related response that often occurs when people experience shame, which is to avoid, but also distance as much as possible, right? So one sort of goal is to overcompensate and show, like, actually, I'm not the person that you think I am. I'm going to overcome it. But there is this sort of secondary perspective, which some people have written about too, which is this idea that when we feel shame, because it is such a painful, aversive emotion, probably the most painful aversive emotion, because it is so self-directed, that we actually sometimes respond with anger. It's referred to as, I think, humiliated fury, right? You're so humiliated that you're really angry. And then you're responding in ways that are also sometimes like, so overcompensation is one way. And then the other way is to kind of almost respond with, I'm going to burn things down, or, which is not exactly, but to the extent of saying, I'm so outraged and I'm so upset. And we see this in the world, right? We see this happening in all kinds of ways where if a group feels shamed in some way, they're responding in these other, and I know we've gone down a path that's slightly different from a taboo topic, but this is a response sometimes to experiencing things in that way.
Well, things that once might have been considered shameful in the workplace don't seem to fall into that category anymore. For instance, there have been many articles written lately about young people videoing themselves being laid off from their jobs, and then sharing it publicly on social media, which I don't think I would ever do. I would be ashamed. It would be embarrassing to me. I don't have the confidence to do that.
Right.
So, Shimon, why do you think some people are willing to be more candid and public about their working lives and on the matters of things that can be shameful?
Yeah, I think there is a big generational difference in this one, to your point of, I don't think I'd be comfortable. I certainly don't. Like, I know the times where I've had certain negative situations occur at work. Like, it's so difficult for me to even talk about them with family, people who are on my side. And so the thought of putting it out for the world to see is its own very interesting, sort of concept. But I think there are these generational differences, and I certainly see it in my class when I'm teaching students who are in that sort of age and stage, which is there is, I think, generationally more of an openness to acknowledging failure, that failure is not about me, it is about the structures that we are in. And so, to some extent, I think that is a big piece of like the shift that we're seeing, which is why certain things that are taboo are not seen as taboo anymore, because we are no longer, sort of owning that this is just us that's occurring, but that's making it occur, that we are not the shift is, it's not about the individual, but really it's the individual within a bigger structure. And so if we think about current sort of younger people who are in the workforce or starting to enter the workforce, they've seen, in their short lives, like everything from multiple recessions, lots of there's like war. They're seeing the effects in some ways of very large structures that have altered their experience. I mean, COVID, where of course there was all of the shifts in the way people were working. And so there's less about this is about me and I've done something to lose this job, but really look at the way our structures are failing us. And so let's acknowledge that. And that, I think, is a piece of this, which is it's moved from shame on me to shame on you, which is what's a shift in the way we've people are starting to think about things like layoffs, for example.
It feels like that could get easily combative.
Yeah.
If it almost feels like it has nothing to do. Do you think that inhibits someone's ability to take responsibility for because sometimes bad news at work is because you didn't do a good job, and it's going to happen to everyone. And it's not a fact, it's not a matter of you have a garbage boss. It might be that you failed at work. Do you think people are going to have a hard time taking responsibility for their own shortcomings?
I think this is a really challenging question because I think it requires sort of ownership on both ends of this, right? So I would say this is a generation that is really open to feedback too, but I think it needs to be sort of shared in particular ways. And, so in line with Attuned's, goals of building psychologically safe environments, I think people who are in psychologically safe environments where there is a constant chain or cycle of sharing feedback, receiving feedback, that I think works really well. And that's the place where you start to see these benefits occur, where we can have open conversations, and those open conversations are seen in the right light versus, where organizational environments are sort of in some ways either not where problems are not acknowledged, or when they are acknowledged, they can be seen as combative. And then we start to see then the responsiveness that is combative when things become open. They take a more combative tone instead of, okay, we're just in this conversation and we'll keep going.
Mm-hmm. Something that can create tension in the workplace is competition, of course. Competing, maybe it's for a visible position, maybe it's as small as, projects that one wants to work on. How does emotional intimacy in the workplace and our newfound closeness with our colleagues affect our notions of things like hierarchical status and competition? Do you think people are more willing to compete, or now that you've got a new closeness with your colleagues, are people less likely to do so? Shimul, what do you think?
So I've done some research on this, and I can certainly share a little bit about this. Workplace relationships are in some ways like the best and worst of all worlds, because unlike our personal lives where we can sort of choose, right? We're with our friends, and then if someone is not really the person you would like to hang out with, you can just withdraw, you can ghost, you can disengage. There's all kinds of ways you can separate those dynamics. Workplace relationships are particularly complicated because one, we also we never choose the people we work with other than maybe a manager when you first get hired. And so you're naturally, sort of in complex relationships where you are competing and cooperating, and you're being rewarded for both, right? Most organizations, you have to be in a team, and so you have to cooperate with people, but then you're also being rewarded for your own individual work. So you're naturally also competing with these same people that you were forced to or required to cooperate with. And then there's also our own sort of personal desire. We want to belong to groups. Humans, we all want to feel like we are the center of groups, we are in supportive networks, but then we also want to be distinctive. We want to stand out. And so, sometimes the more you have balance on one side, the more difficult it becomes to do on the other side, right? So if you form these very, very, very deeply positive relationships with people at work, which is something that I would, I'm a big fan of, and I would encourage people to do if they can, there is the tension of constantly, it does lead to more ambivalence when you are put in competitive situations, right? So ambivalence is when you feel both supported and antagonistic, or both positive and negative. And those are it's a challenging experience to be in. And so typically what we find is people are going to pick one or the other. It's difficult to live in a place of ambivalence. And so you're either going to go whole hog on, I am going to compete and I'm going to do that as much as I can, or I'm going to sort of cooperate and I'm going to focus on the relationship, which then means, to your question, that we're doing less competing, so both of these things could have differential effects. And I'll just add a couple of things. There are people who manage to do both, and that's also complicated. And, what does that mean for long-term relationships with the person? If you are somehow, supporting them, but then also competing. And I think the key here would be the way you keep that relationship positive is by being very honest that you are also in competition instead of covertly engaging in the competition.
Sometimes that I imagine those feelings might come up when layoffs occur, and that there's that you might experience a feeling of ambivalence where I'm really sad that my coworkers are gone, but I'm also really glad it wasn't me. And I think there might be an element of competition, because maybe you're thinking, well, I guess I won this round because I'm still working here. So yeah, I can imagine there are a lot of people feeling that, especially in the United States, or there have been very, very large scale layoffs in the last year, really. And so I would imagine a lot of people are feeling that way. Something that's happening globally this year is that something like more than 60 countries are going to be holding an election. Some have already occurred. Do you expect politics to be a part of workplace chatter? I know there are a lot of issues that have become political. When I talk about politics, I'm thinking of what political party do you belong to? Do you plan on voting? What candidate might you vote for? And of course, there will be pieces that have become political that will be a part of that. But generally, I'm talking about politics in a more narrow sense. How might, do you think this will be a part of the workplace this year? And how do you think that might affect workplace relationships? Yingli, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that is a very hard topic. And I personally heard about this story that one of the PhD students, because they didn't share the same political affiliation with their advisor, and they found it's really hard to work with their advisor, which is a shame, because we are in academia, so it should all stay professional, right? So why the political affiliation plays such a big role here. So if you think about this kind of story, it's really sad that the political affiliation can actually tear us apart. And so that is really sad. But at the same time, I could imagine on the flip side, if they share the similar views of politics, right? So they could build a very good and enduring relationship, because now they have more things in similar. And so in the psychology, we have this theory called similarity attraction theory, meaning that the more similar you feel you have with the other person, the more likely you get along, build a relationship, build trust. So I could say that is talking about politics is absolutely a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
I'll
it
pop
certainly
in and
could
just
be what
add a little bit.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, sure, go ahead.
yeah. I think this is really fascinating just because it is in some ways the most emotional of experiences, right? Because our political identities are often signals of our values. And so as a result of that, this becomes something that is very difficult to keep out of work, even if you are not talking about a particular party, just by signaling certain things you might say you're conveying where you might be. And that's when everyone's sensitivities are high. There are certainly things that, that can lead to, and Yingli made some really great points. I have a doctoral student who has been really interested in this topic of affective polarization and what happens at work. And he did some research. It was very US centric research after some political debates and asking people sort of the day after in online samples, did you talk about these debates at work, right? Because if you think about it, it's just conversation. You show up the next day and you say things like, oh, look, what'd you do? Oh, I watched the news, or did you watch the debate? And then in just sharing that, people are likely, even if they don't say, oh, I thought this person did a good job, or this person did a good job, even just sort of signaling by the way they talk about it, where their affiliation might lie has had, like, what he found was did have significant effects not only on their relationship, but their desire to work with each other. And the thing that landed up being the most critical was when it was a surprise, right? Because often we go through our work lives thinking that everybody's like us, and then suddenly someone might say something, and if it goes against it, that was in some ways like the factor that led many of this to sort of this negative, the negative response was very swift and very strong. So if you knew it already, you just were like, well, I've worked with you and I think that's fine. But if it was surprising to you, you were more likely to sort of disengage as quickly as possible.
I can think of very specific moments in my life where I've had a friend, maybe a long time friend, not even in the workplace, and they'll say something and I realize they assume something about my political beliefs. And we assume that we agree. And then suddenly they'll say, oh, well, this is how I feel about that kind of thing. And obviously you feel the same way. And you can feel the temperature change. You're like, oh, and you don't want to create friction right there. I'm not confrontational. I don't particularly want to get into arguments or disagreements. That's not typically my nature. And so I just feel like I want to run out of the room because it just feels so uncomfortable. I'm even like, I think I just blushed thinking about it because I'm remembering specific instances when this happened. Something that unfortunately has come with political discourse are conspiratorial beliefs. This can be something that is very uncomfortable to talk about. I understand that some people might not even know that they hold conspiratorial beliefs. But I know, Yingli, this is something that you have studied. This is fascinating to me. Do people tend to be aware of their conspiratorial beliefs? And how does this affect our workplace relationships?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. And before answer that question, I think it may good to start think about why some people hold the conspiracy beliefs where others don't. So there are many factors contribute to the conspiracy beliefs, and one main factor is the sense of control. So research has shown that when you feel like you lose the control, you are more likely to believe in the conspiracy theories. So imagine like you are trying to navigate a dark room without a flashlight. And when you feel that way, you are more likely to connect the dots between things that aren't really related. So it's a bit like seeing ships in the clouds. The idea here is that if you can't get your hands on that flashlight, you might start to feel more control just by making sense of these ships, and in this case, believe in conspiracy beliefs. So I would say people have different reasons to believe in conspiracy beliefs, but normally when you feel lose of control, you don't know how to interpret the facts, interpret your environment, then you are more likely to hold the conspiracy beliefs. And in my own research, I look in how believing in the conspiracy beliefs theories, especially for the COVID-19, affect how people view the importance of vaccine. So it's very tricky because once someone buy these conspiracy beliefs, it is actually very hard to change their mind. And if you provide them with some facts, it can actually backfire sometimes, making them more likely to even like title to those beliefs. So in our study, we're trying to find a way or find a strategy to combat the conspiracy beliefs. And we suggest that one way to do it is by perspective taking. So picture yourself step into someone else's shoes and seeing the world through their eyes can actually help you to deal with the conspiracy beliefs. It isn't just about empathy. It's a powerful tool that has been shown to help people communicate better, improve the relationships, or even resolve the conflict. So if we think that for those who believe the COVID-19 related conspiracy theories, they might start to see the importance of vaccine in a new light if they begin to find some common ground with someone who has a positive view on vaccine. So they might be less influenced by the conspiracy theories. And for the workplace, I know there's some research conducted by my colleagues showing that during the COVID-19 lockdowns, they noticed that the more out of control people felt, the more they were support to the leaders who believe the conspiracy theories of the virus. So it seems that when the world feels uncertain, people tend to gravitate towards anyone who can offer a sense of certainty and order, and even it's through the conspiracies. So this really shows that even in the workplace, right, if your leader can provide some explanation to some facts, even it's conspiracies, and when people feel they lose the control, they tend to support that leader compared to a leader who provide more factual, let's say, numbers or the facts to explain the situation. So I found that research is really fascinating.
We have a question that came in through the Q&A. I thought I would throw this to you guys. It's from Sherry, and they ask, in my office, there are a lot of passive aggressive comments made about age, right down to upper management coming to more tenured staff with a spreadsheet showing who has been around the longest. Ooh, this is, this doesn't sound good. Sometimes it might just be to talk about tenure, but that can also indicate somebody's age, of course. This person asked if you guys can share any info on ageism. Is that something that either of you have looked at in your research? Shimol, what was that grin?
No, I haven't. And I think, I saw the question come in the chat and I thought to myself, I wish in some ways Yingli might know more about this, but there is in some ways such little work that's been done on ageism and how it, sort of affects us at work. And but it sounds to me, just even in the terminology that was used was the use of the word passive aggressive. In some ways, it sounds like this is, the reason I kind of grimaced a little was I was like, this sounds like a form of a microaggression. And these in some ways are the most insidious to try and highlight or confront because, microaggressions are in some ways, they occur, they're not something that someone can directly say, hey, why do you say that? Or why do you do that? Right. In a way, that's why they keep occurring. And that's why they're so difficult to navigate because it's hard to sort of hold someone accountable unless there's a very clear definition that's sort of put forth that we all agree that this behavior is egregious or wrong. And so that's one of the reasons that, whenever, I'm look, I know I've been through a number of these trainings. I teach about microaggressions in class, and we call them another way to sort of think about them is these micro inequities, these things that are hard to define, but they are ultimately resulting in inequitable outcomes. And so really, as we think about how to navigate them, sometimes, particularly in situations like ageism, I think one of the best ways is to actually have someone on the flip. So it sounds like they are more, I don't know whether the question was about penalizing younger workers or older workers, but depending on where it stands, to have the group that is sort of being supported and have someone in that group speak up and say, I think this is a bit awkward, because if it is the group that is being penalized, then it just looks like you're kind of, you're looking for ways to poke, and it just adds more fuel sometimes to the fire for someone who might get very defensive when when that group says something. So instead, the group that is seen more positively, there needs to be someone there who sort of speaks up and says, and that's one of the sort of, in some ways, the best ways to address microaggressions.
Yingli, is this anything that you've looked at? Have you come across ageism in the research that you've done? Maybe it's intersected with some of the work that you and your colleagues have done.
I wish I would have, but like Shimura said, we studied microaggression a lot, so that is a concept, but it's mainly about race and gender. Correct me if I'm wrong. So for the age, right? So I would say, yeah, we definitely need more research about it.
Well, this was, I'll direct us then to a question that came in ahead of the panel from a future attendee via email. And this person asks, asks for advice about when a team has different people on a team have different ideas about what is taboo and what isn't. And I think this might be a good description of microaggression. So, I said that thing. I didn't think it was a topic that I couldn't broach, but someone else on my team wanted to say, hey, you can't say that, or that's unkind, or that makes me uncomfortable. So this person asks, is there a way to find a middle ground, or is something automatically taboo if one person on the team feels that if it's off limits? How would you recommend folks deal with that? Or what have you seen in the work that you've done?
I'm happy to take a stab at this. These are great questions, like really, really, really questions that are, in some ways, I will just say as a researcher, they're very interesting questions, and they're so difficult to study because of how nuanced they are. So I think we can give, some thoughts. But so one of the things I'd say is, there's like two levels, or almost like two questions embedded in this. There's the question of what we would describe as sort of intent versus impact, right? So you're saying something about someone, and or a group or a identity or a situation, and your intent is just to make an observation or say something as it's sold, but the impact of it is really hard. And I think that's a very real and important thing for teams to talk about. Like, how do we have those conversations? Are we immediately attacking the person who said something? I mean, there are things that are very egregious, and let's keep that out. But the things that sit in the more of the gray area, or are we sort of having a call in where we're going to talk about it together, is like why this was uncomfortable or why it shouldn't have been said. So I think one piece of it is, when you're talking about a different group, I think that's a really important thing that's different than you talking about yourself, right? And your own experience. And both of those things can have elements that are taboo. So if you're talking about a different group and have an opinion, that's where you have to be really careful in some ways to sort of avoid things that could be construed as taboo topics. And so maybe the person's perspective of, let's not talk about that because it's your judgment of something else. If you, on the other hand, are sharing something about yourself, right, and your own experience, I think at that point, that really depends to some extent on the type of culture you've created in your organization, because I think individuals should feel comfortable to some extent to share an experience that they've had, and people should be willing to listen to that one as that stands, because I think it's a different lens, which is it about me or is it about you?
Yeah, I think that is I think that is a really good question that came in, because there are people, I think people in general are trying to figure out what is it okay for me to share my opinion on. Everyone's going to have opinions, but is it okay if I disclose mine? Is that appropriate? Am I allowed to have an opinion on this? Am I going to be penalized for having an opinion on this? Am I going to offend someone without even meaning to? You know, my intentions are not bad, or maybe I want to ask a question about something, and I'm not sure if that's a topic that can be broached. I think that's difficult for a lot of people.
It is. I'm sorry to I just think this is so fascinating. I would say when you have a question like that, instead of saying it out loud to a group of people, it might be nice to test it with one person that you trust, and maybe as a good practice, which is when you're like, should I be saying that? And if you have that thought, then immediately don't say it in a big group and test it with someone else. And then through that experience, you understand the norms of what's appropriate, what's not, what the team, and then you can start to sort of understand how to navigate.
I'd like to put a question to our audience. If you guys want to get in on the chat, or you can submit anonymously in the Q&A. I'm curious to know if you felt a colleague has overshared with you at work. There was this is something that I have been thinking a lot as a journalist. I write about DEI quite a bit, and things like menopause in the workplace, lots of issues that affect women. And there are some women who are very happy to talk about, for instance, menopause at work, and others really don't want to be asked or don't want to hear about their colleagues' experience. It makes them uncomfortable. So I'd love to hear from the audience whether you feel like someone has overshared with you at work, and what did you do? Did you want to run screaming from the room like I might want to do? So for Yingli and Shmuel, how does the ubiquity of remote work change our willingness to share emotional intimacy with our colleagues? And what are those implications? I wonder if it makes us more or less willing to be emotionally intimate if we're not in the room with our colleagues. Yingli, let's start with you. What do you think?
Yeah, again, that is absolutely a fascinating question. And I would say on one side, right, remote working, it's actually change how open we are about our feelings with our coworkers. So on one side, when we are all behind screens, some of us might feel more comfortable sharing personal stuff because there's a kind of a safety in not being physically present. It's like the screen acts as a buffer, giving us the courage to express the things that we might not have in our office setting. But of course, on the flip side, the remote work can also make some people feel more isolated, making it harder to form those close personal connections you get from face-to-face interactions. So this could mean some folks might hold back more, keeping conversations strictly professional. And as an implication, it's a mixed bag, I would say. You're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm curious to know, Yingli, personally, which do you feel more comfortable with? Do you feel more comfortable talking openly when someone is physically in the room with you, or maybe when you can't see them or you're on Zoom and not physically present? What do you feel personally?
I personally prefer face-to-face interactions with people. And actually, there's a concept called relational energy, meaning when you interact with others, you can actually get energized. I actually feel this a lot after the COVID. So after had been working from home for 1 year, when I actually go out and hang out with my friends, my colleagues, I actually can feel this relational energy. So I feel more energized and more passionate about my job after I interact with my coworkers and my friends. So I think that is great. So I normally prefer face-to-face interactions with my colleagues and my friends. But of course, I could say if it's a little bit privacy or sensitive topics, maybe chat on Zoom or via the text, maybe more or less awkward, I would say, or more comfortable. So I guess that is just a personal preference.
Well, what have you observed about remote work and our willingness to be more open or less open with people with whom we work?
Yeah. I think Yingli made really amazing points. They're, right on target with what the research says, and I think what people's experiences are. There is, something that it's challenging on Zoom, particularly when you are more than one person, to not have clear eye contact, right? So eye contact is a signal of so much. It's a signal of building trust. It's a signal of listening. It's a signal of interest. It's all kinds of things. And it's hard to know, when you're on, like we're thinking, we're on a 3-person Zoom, where are my eyes? Are you seeing my eyes in the way that, am I at eye level? All of these things that make it challenging for us sometimes to be sharing personal things because we rely on these cues just to make sense of them. And so, I think this is like what can make relationship building on remotely very difficult, because often interactions online are seen as transactional. We're here to get our work done. Let's get our work done and leave. And so to have those, it just requires more effort. Like you have to build in lots of process. And once that's done, you can reach the same outcomes, but it's much more, I think it takes a longer time to get there.
I wonder if people are now more willing or less willing to engage in interpersonal conflict in the workplace. Shmuel, you've studied something called frenemies. Now, I was a girl in high school in the 2000s, so I know exactly what a frenemy is. Maintained many of them. But Shmuel, for our audience, could you tell us what is a frenemy and what role do they play in the workplace?
Yeah, that's so I briefly alluded to this earlier when I was talking about these ambivalent relationships. So if we think about ambivalence as an experience that is both positive and negative at the same time, when it comes to our emotions or our cognitions or feelings about things, a frenemy is simply an ambivalent relationship. So it's a person towards which you feel both positive or negative, and it can come from sort of these experiences of cooperation and competition or support, but then like odd feelings of antagonism at times. Like, so these relationships that are just in their own way, very complex, very mixed. And you can have, a relationship that is deeply so, and then a relationship that is occasionally so. It's, one of the things that's also important to know, that a frenemy isn't just someone who you are always positive and negative about, but you can fluctuate your feelings about them as well. Relationships are long, our experiences can change. And as long as it's kind of flip-flopping back and forth, like that could be a person you describe, you sort of have those experiences with, that sort of defines what that means. And partly it does, I think this is the question of our desire to sort of stay away from interpersonal conflict, often does lead to these types of relationships, right? Because research that has been done for many, many years really looked at relationships as, oh, this person is my friend, someone I feel positively towards almost all the time, or this person is my enemy. This person is a person I feel negatively towards all the time. Turns out like very few of us have like real enemies, right? If you like look inward and you're like, do I have an enemy? Like you might have had someone in high school, maybe there's someone like really actively trying to like, compete with you at work. But on average, like most of us kind of go through our world wanting to build positive relationships, but then there are these factors that make it difficult sometimes. And so, our discomfort with just leaning into competitions, which is sometimes what we often need to do, causes us to sort of build these, to have these like goals of relationship building at the same time, leading to sort of this, as a result of which we have less conflict. And, it's important in organizational behavior, we talk about different kinds of conflict, constructive conflict and destructive conflict. Often when we're at work, conflict is just seen as one big, like, I can't have conflict. But really, constructive conflict is a really positive thing. You can like debate and discussion and really pushing people, playing devil's advocate. These are great things for us all to be engaging in, versus destructive conflict, where you're really sort of like actively trying to hurt or sabotage someone in the way you're behaving, or stonewalling them, not responding to them, actively hiding information from them. That's a very different kind of conflict. And we tend to sort of, just as people at work, tend to think about all of it as bad, instead of realizing that it's okay for us to be pushing and arguing as long as we're doing it with like better like goals in mind, instead of just like sort of interpersonal, just versus being interpersonally problematic.
So something I would imagine goes along with frenemies is gossip.
Mhm.
What motivates people to gossip about their colleagues?
Right. Well, what motivates us to gossip in general, right? As just people who, so I studied this for my dissertation. I was really interested in this interpersonal behavior that we label. I mean, I would say for the last, as long as humankind has existed or the writings of humankind have existed, people have said, religions and texts have said, don't gossip. It's really bad. Stop gossiping. And yet it is one of the only behaviors that continues, right? Like we just continue to engage in it at work, outside of work. And so why we do it because it's really functional. It allows us to build like a map of our social environment, like who should we trust, who shouldn't we trust. So that's sort of a information gathering piece. But then there's all the second piece that it also sort of allows us to fulfill is a desire to get to know someone else, right? By telling you what I think about another person, I have now made myself very vulnerable to you. And you telling me you've made yourself really vulnerable to me because now you have information that you've shared that could go back to that person, and often does, right? And so it's a way to sort of also very quickly establish trust with someone, which is many of us can probably think about a moment where someone came to our office or our space and said, hey, let me talk to you about somebody. And you're like, oh, I guess we're friends now. Like that was the immediate, like you trust me enough to tell me this. So it's an immediate indicator of trust as well. And in my research, I found that sharing gossip actually is a positive mood inducer. And I want to also highlight, it doesn't matter if you're sharing good things about a person or bad things about a person. It actually is just the experience of, to Yingli's point of this relational energy. It's a positive relational energy. You're like sharing information. There's something about talking about somebody who's not there that is an energizing experience. And that positive mood induction can lead to all kinds of positive outcomes like relationship building and lack of conflict or less conflict, more cooperation, and so on.
It does make you feel very special when someone confides in you. I never thought about it in terms of making yourself vulnerable to somebody else. It does speed up this process of emotional intimacy and that, hey, we're in this together and I'm going to need to know this because I can't contain myself anymore. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to put this question to you guys. What topics do you think remain off limits in the workforce, in the workplace for now? And what incentivizes or disincentivizes people to talk about tough subjects? Yingli, I want to start with you. Love to know what you think.
Yeah, I think this question, we've already covered it through our conversation, right? So the pros and the cons about having these sensitive topics, and the relationship building, like it's definitely the beneficial outcome that will come from like discuss or sharing these sensitive topics. And in terms of particularly things that off the list, I can't think of anything else that we haven't covered. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess the question is, and going right back to where you started, which is what should we be talking about and what shouldn't? I had a dean who just retired who said, I don't want anybody to be authentic. Like, can you stop with so much authenticity? And she was joking, but she had this point when she was like, do we really need to be hearing everything about everything? Right. And that's like a little piece of this, which is, I think it's really important for us to be able to bring our identities. I think the day-to-day experience of everything we're experiencing doesn't always have to come to work, right? So I think that's the piece where this gets really complex. But I do think that whatever we do, it has to be fair. So if a person with an identity, like if a person can talk about one religion, can talk about their religion at work without fear of, someone responding negatively, that everybody should feel comfortable to do that. It shouldn't be a question of a majority versus a minority. Same thing with politics. If one group can talk, we should make it open for the other group to talk, also without the fear of getting punished for what they say. So I think it's more than like what we should or not do. There just needs to be some equity in allowing everyone with their different perspectives and identities to share it.
Well, we are pretty much out of time, but this has been great. And I will say, you just set off like a chain reaction of comments and questions with gossip. Did not realize that would be such a hot topic, but I think it's something that we all engage in. We've probably also been hurt by it too. But I just want to thank everybody for attending. Shmuel and Yingli, thank you so much for being here. You guys are so knowledgeable, and I love hearing about the research that you do. This webinar has been brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. If you'd like to learn more about how Attuned can enhance communication within your organization, visit attuned.ai. A recording of this webinar will be available at attuned.ai on their website. And I think if you registered, you should be getting one by email as well. Thank you all so much for attending. And of course, Dr. Dang, Dr. Mawani, thank you so much. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.